Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Nurse Reviews Cells at Work Code Black. It finally feels like spring here and it's like 14 degrees Celsius outside, which is really warm actually for this time of year where I live. Usually it's like still snowing. So to celebrate, I am drinking some peach green tea, which is actually really good. It's from a local seller in Toronto. Yeah, it's also Easter today on this day of recording, but since everything is closed and I can't go visit my family, there's nothing better to do than just record inside. Yeah, so to further on this depression, let's talk about episode number 10 of Cells at Work Code Black. So this episode is called Stomach Ulcer, Friendship, and Loss, which sounds dark and depressing, which is perfect for pandemic Easter, I guess. So by the time this video comes out, Easter will have already passed, but for those of you who do celebrate it, I hope you had a very happy and safe Easter despite the pandemic. And yeah, to celebrate, let's just dive right into Cells at Work Code Black. Cheers.
飲み込んだ食物を貯蓄し、胃壁から分泌される胃酸によって殺菌する。また、消化酵素のペプシンにより、食物はドロドロの状態に溶かされ、消化の第一段階が行われる。
So the stomach. We have finally reached the stomach, and honestly, it's probably one of the most amazing organs if you really think about it. And that's because stomach acid is incredibly acidic. So if you recall back to your high school chemistry class, we have something called the pH scale. And the pH scale ranges from 1 to 14, with 7 being right in the middle and being a true neutral. So when you have a pH number, the lower that number and closer to 1 it is, the more acidic that substance is. On the other hand, the higher the number and closer to 14 it is, the more basic or alkaline that substance is. So for reference, our stomach acid is roughly in the range of 1.5 to 3 on the pH scale, which is like insanely acidic. Battery acid beats it only by a small margin, and that is, to me, insane. The very fact that your body can safely store an acid like that without it breaching out and damaging the rest of the body is absolutely insane to me. However, that acid is most definitely needed. So first of all, it is one of the ways your body defends itself from outside bacteria and viruses and stuff by way of coming in through like the food. So if the food is obviously going to have some bacteria, for example, that gastric acid is just going to kill it off because it's so acidic. As we see here as well, there are a lot of digestive enzymes in there that are gonna just break down that food into a substance that we call chyme. And chyme is just basically partially digested food in the stomach. There are numerous ways that your body is able to protect the stomach from the harsh stomach acid, which we will kind of go into a little bit later. However, I do want to point out one small correction, and that is the fact that the first step of digestion actually does not happen in the stomach. The first step of digestion actually happens when you first put that food or whatever into your mouth. So your saliva is secreted by, I think, three pairs of salivary glands. I'd have to double check that. But your saliva actually has digestive enzymes in it. So for example, it has lipase, which can help break down fats, and amylase, which can help break down carbohydrates such as sugars. This is why you can pop something like a hard candy in your mouth and it'll slowly dissolve over time. That's because you have digestive enzymes like amylase breaking down those sugars before you ultimately go and swallow it and it gets further digested in your stomach.
やる気のないやつは今すぐ出て行け。強力な胃酸をコントロールするため、俺たち胃の細胞は命がけで働いている。だが、今そのコントロールがうまくいかなくなっちまってな。
So this is actually really cute. So like I said, there are numerous ways your body is able to protect the stomach from that really strong stomach acid. And one of those is actually through the secretion of mucus that we see here. So your stomach is composed of different layers. The outside layers are basically composed of layers of muscle, and those muscles are responsible for two things. One of them is to sort of mix up the food or the partially digested food in with those gastric acids and the digestive juices and things like that to promote digestion. The second is when the stomach is ready to empty, those muscles are responsible for pushing that digested food into the duodenum, which is the first section of the small intestine. The layer that's more on the inside is what we call the mucosal layer, and it's here that we find a lot of the secretory cells, like our very grumpy chief cell, that help both secrete digestive enzymes and things like that, as well as stuff that's just there to protect the stomach. One of the things that these cells produce is mucus, and it's this mucus that sort of coats the inside of that stomach and helps protect that mucosal layer from the stomach acid. Those cells also produce sodium bicarbonate, which is an alkaline substance. And if you remember, an alkaline substance is opposite to an acid. So when you throw the two opposites together, they neutralize each other. So that sodium bicarbonate is there to help neutralize the stomach acid in order to protect that lining of the stomach.
見ろ。胃に潰瘍ができて粘膜層を突破されちまった。潰瘍？胃は普段胃粘膜に守られているから胃酸で溶けることはないが、その粘膜が傷ついて酸に侵食されちまってるんだ。
胃潰瘍。普段胃を守っている粘膜の機能が低下し、胃酸を中和しきれなくなり、胃酸によって胃自体が溶かされてしまうことにより起こる。
A stomach ulcer, like we see here, is when the lining of the stomach is slowly eaten away by the gastric acid. These ulcers can be divided into two categories, superficial and deep. And they are exactly how they sound. So a superficial ulcer only affects that mucosal layer that I was talking about earlier, which is formed on the inside of the stomach. A deep stomach ulcer has pierced through that mucosal layer and is starting to affect the muscular layers more on the outside of the stomach. And as you can imagine, that is really bad. Alright guys, here's your cat Jax for today. She's really needy today and won't stop crying, so here's Gus. There you go, Gus.
悪いがここじゃこんなことは日常茶飯事でな。アルコールや脂っこいものの暴飲暴食、さらには喫煙にストレス、荒れ放題で胃酸から守ってくれる粘膜が剥がれちまってんだ。
Alright, so let us talk about risk factors for stomach ulcers. So he already mentioned a few of them, and it's absolutely correct. So for starters, our host body is known to smoke very heavily, and smoking cigarettes, as we've talked about earlier, has so many side effects that are bad for your body, including heart disease and lung disease and all sorts of horrible things. So smoking will actually interfere with the pH of your stomach lining and actually interfere with the stomach's ability to protect that lining from the gastric acid and the digestive enzymes. Studies have shown that smokers, both current and previous, are twice as likely to have stomach ulcers than people who have never smoked before. As for diet, there is actually less strong evidence to suggest that diet is linked with stomach ulcers. They do suggest for people who have stomach ulcers and things like that to eat a more bland diet and to avoid acidic foods or spicy foods, because it's thought to only make the gastric acid secretion worse. But the research just is kind of lacking on that front. As for stress, similarly with dietary changes, there is less evidence to suggest that stress directly causes stomach ulcers. We do know that there is a link. There is a lot of studies to show that people who are experiencing a lot of chronic stress are more likely to develop stomach ulcers. However, anybody who has studied research at all knows that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. We know that there's a link, but we don't know if one causes the other. There are some other risk factors, and one of the most important ones is infection by a bacteria called H. pylori. H. pylori is a bacteria that has evolved to be able to survive the inside of the stomach, despite all the gastric acids and the digestive enzymes that are in there. And it is this bacteria that is known for actually damaging the lining of your stomach and causing ulcers. For most developed countries like us here in Canada or like in Japan, the incidence of stomach ulcers and peptic ulcer disease has actually decreased over time just because of higher sanitation and hygiene efforts and things like that have caused a decrease in H. pylori infections. One of the other big risk factors is the use of a drug class called NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. These are unfortunately very common medications, and I'm guilty of using them a lot too. So certain medications that fall into this class that are very commonly used include aspirin, which people will use for pain relief, as well as for treatment of cardiovascular diseases. What else? Ibuprofen, which is commonly sold here as Advil or Motrin. Another one is naproxen, which is commonly sold as Aleve here, which is like my drug of choice. Yeah, these drugs are incredibly hard on the lining of your stomach, and if you have an H. pylori infection at the same time, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a stomach ulcer. I know when I have to take high amounts of NSAIDs, like when I have an acute back injury, I end up having to take a medication called pantoprazole to kind of offset that and protect my stomach lining from that medication. Otherwise, I get a lot of heartburn and it's just really not comfortable. It is unfortunately a prescription drug though, so it's not something you can get like over the counter here. So this is something that my doctor will order for me.
最近嘘だろあんなバカでけえやつがしかもこの遺産の海の中で生きてられるなんて
そうやつこそがこの異界王の原因にもなってる強力な酸で満たされた中でも生きられる菌ピロリ菌だ
I knew it! I called it! I knew it! So H. pylori, funny thing is, I actually did learn about it in school. Do I remember a whole heck of a lot? No, I don't. If you look up the shape of H. pylori, the bacteria actually is shaped almost like a helix or a spiral. And that's actually how it got its name, because H stands for Helicobacter. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm probably not. But Helicobacter just refers to the fact that it is a bacteria shaped like a spiral or a helix. Even my cat is sad. She's crying in the corner there. Oh, oh God, I have no words. I knew Cells at Work Code Black was gonna be like dark, but I didn't really expect them to kill off his friend. That's horrible. I'm gonna need a minute. I'm gonna get it. The tea's going away. I need something stronger. Real talk. One of the more common complications of ulcers is bleeding. Gastrointestinal bleeds can generally be divided into upper and lower GI bleeds. So your upper GI tract includes things like your esophagus, your stomach, and the duodenum, which, like we talked about earlier, is that beginning portion of the small intestine. The lower GI tract, on the other hand, is sort of just everywhere past that point. So for example, the rest of your small intestine, your large intestine or your colon, as well as your rectum. Depending on where the bleed is, the patient will exhibit different signs and symptoms. So for example, if you have a bleed in the stomach, like we see here, that blood will go into the stomach and start to coagulate and be partially digested by those gastric enzymes and stomach acid. When there is blood in the stomach, that blood actually acts as an irritant to the stomach, and that stimulates the muscles of the stomach to start contracting. This means that the patient will often feel the need to vomit or have diarrhea, which is just wonderful for me as a nurse. So because that blood has had time to coagulate and be digested in the stomach, it actually starts to change appearance once it makes its way out of the body. So when a patient vomits up some of that blood, it actually shows up in what we call coffee ground emesis. Emesis just is the fancy medical term for vomit. And the coffee grounds is exactly how it sounds like. It actually looks like the patient is vomiting up coffee grounds. And the coffee grounds are actually that coagulated and partially digested blood. If the blood should travel downwards, then it will show up in the patient's stool. So because that blood has had time to digest and coagulate, it ends up looking like this dark, tarry stool that we call melena stool. Sometimes it can look almost maroonish, but yeah, it's all the same. It all kind of falls under melena stool. Melena stool can be caused by other things besides GI bleeding. So for example, one of the more common reasons is just taking iron supplements. Melena stool doesn't always mean you're bleeding, but it is one of those things that you do kind of have to keep in the back of your mind. Another characteristic of melena stool is that it smells absolutely horrendous. It just like permeates the air and is, in my whole nursing career, literally the worst thing I have smelled in my life. It beats out pretty well everything, including durian. With a lower GI bleed, typically you won't see too much vomiting and you won't see that coffee ground emesis, simply because the bleed is further down. What you would see, however, is stool that has more blood in it, and so it's actually a bit more visible and looks more like blood because it's in that lower GI tract and has not had the time to start coagulating, and it hasn't really been digested a whole heck of a lot. Now, GI bleed as a diagnosis is probably one of the scariest things I can see in my chart. And that's probably for a few different reasons. So one of them is the fact that with GI bleeds, it's all internal. I can't really see how bad the bleeding is. Sure, I could generally kind of guesstimate how much they're losing based on what I see in their vomit or in their stool, but it's not the greatest indicator. So in a sense, when I have a GI bleed patient, I'm flying blind. I don't really know how bad it is until they start to decompensate and start to look really unwell. And that to me is really terrifying. The other reason that as a nurse, there's not really a whole heck of a lot I can do until the patient just goes sees a gastroenterologist who can throw a scope down the esophagus and take a look in there and see where the bleeding is. So as a nurse, pretty much the most I can do is replace the lost blood loss and volume by giving IV fluids or blood transfusion. I can give proton pump inhibitors like this medication that help reduce the amount of acid secretion in the stomach to protect it. Usually through an IV though, not usually the pill form. What else can I do? That's kind of about it, I think. The other one is that they can bleed really, really fast. And again, you won't necessarily know it. The mortality rate for GI bleeds can be quite high. I've lost a fair amount of patients to GI bleeds, and they can get very, very severe. The other thing that makes this very scary that they don't really touch on so much in this episode is the fact that we know this patient is a heavy drinker to the point where it's affecting his liver function. Now, if you remember way back to episode 2, I think, we talked a bit about the various functions of the liver. One of the functions of the liver is producing coagulation factors. So when the liver is not functioning properly, what happens a lot is these patients don't have the coagulation factors necessary in order to stop any bleeding. I will say that the patients that I have lost to GI bleeds typically also have pre-existing liver disease, meaning that they just bleed out that much faster and the bleeds are that much more severe. Even though it's like the middle of the day right now, I'm just gonna like continue day drinking. That being said, don't drink too much. I hardly ever drink, but yeah, I feel like this episode warrants it. In any case, that was a very depressing episode. I'm curious to see where they go from here on out. Like, can it get worse? Don't answer that. I know it can. I actually haven't watched any further than this. Yeah, so I'm gonna finish my drink and then, yeah, edit this video and upload it. But yeah, I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys enjoyed. Cheers to our fallen red blood cell friend. And yeah, I shall see you all next time. Bye.